The choice of the topic today was actually due to Peter, who was very insistent, you need to talk about calligraphy. And I don't need much urging to do that because I often talk about calligraphy, but we'll just jump into it. The title, Journey Through Space and Time, actually has a kind of a literal meaning, as will become clear. This is neither related to Rengetsu or Nantenbō, but before talking about calligraphy, I think it's valuable to just think of a minute about how do we look at calligraphy and what should we look for and what kind of approach, because not only in the West, but even in Asia today, calligraphy is often badly misunderstood in terms of how to look at it. Even in the Tokyo National Museum, if you're looking at Japanese viewers of the calligraphy room, they'll face a scroll like this and say, what does it say? And then spend a long time trying to figure out, although it's probably on the label, which character means what. And then they figure it out, I've got it, and walk on to the next without any sense of the artistic value of the work. It becomes like a puzzle, like calligraphers do things in certain ways to make it hard to read, and the job is to uncover the meaning. Of course, it's not to say that the meaning of the poem or whatever is unrelated of significance, but that's really literature. And many, you can have a letter, and it's very interesting for reading what the person is wanting to say, or you can have original poems, which certainly reflect the spirit of the artist. In many cases, though, they're taking famous poems of China and Japan that traditionally were already well known. But when we're talking about calligraphy as an art form, it's not about the literature, it's about the form, and it's about the style and how it's rendered. And just to make that clear, we're taking this example of Takahashi Deishu, a large cursive work. And how do we look at this? We need to think about it and to sort of emphasize the point that I was just talking about. This is the same poem written in 3 different ways. So in other words, the literary content is identical of these 3, but the visual content is quite different. On the left, we have the scroll that we started out with. In the middle, in a kind of clerical script, we have anonymous calligrapher just rendering it again, the same characters. And on the right, we have a modern person who is just giving a so-called nyomi, or a reading with a pen and sort of penmanship, if you will. But it's the same poem. So in terms of the meaning, in terms of the literary meaning, it's the same. But the aesthetic meaning is obviously quite different. And so when we're looking at calligraphy as an art form, while it's nice to know what it means, the meaning as an art form is really encapsulated in how it's written and what kinds of forms and what kinds of styles and so on. Excuse me. So here, turning back to the scroll, and we can see the top 2 horizontal lines, the top half on the right, is just set in standard script. That's the poem. It's a poem by a relatively little-known early Tang poet, Li Jung. And while it's a nice nature poem, as an art form, it's really not the poem, it's the shape and the way it's done. And so the literary content is identical on the left and the upper 2 lines there, but the artistic quality is quite different. To look at that differently, here are 6 different calligraphers writing the same character. You see the character for Mu down there in the lower left, and you see that that's the formal, correct form of the character, but all of these are the same character written in different forms. And so you can see immediately the expressive form of this same meaning, same character, but very different styles, very different compositions, reveals the sort of the nature of the artistic impulse and the expressive impulse of the calligraphy. I know the names of all these people, but it gets a little too detailed, but we're looking at calligraphy that stretches from about 1700 to early 20th century here. And more of the same here with a very simple character for Tsuki. It's the Getsu of Rengetsu. And again, these different ways of writing Tsuki from the 18th century and ending with near contemporary Inoue Yuichi at the bottom, all writing the same character, but with a very different expressive modality in each case. And here too, the same simple character no, which can have many meanings, including sort of a possessive, but there's a ratio at the top and two different forms of archaic script on the right. And it gives you a sense of the range possible just for the same character. But it's not just a matter of a different composition, sometimes different lines, but the character of the lines and all of this you see as being radically different. And so when we're looking at calligraphy, it's these kinds of differences of line and composition that become the expressive force of the sort of the artistic merit of the calligraphy. One last example, there's a wonderful sort of avant-garde for his day haiku poet, Kawahigashi Hekigoto, who seems to have resolved to never have done his signature in the same way. Hundreds and hundreds of different versions of the same character. And so here's 4 examples, but there are hundreds. You know, it's hard to find 2 that are the same. It's always the same character, which you can see there. The character is this character, but it's written in these ways and many, many other ways when he signed his work. So again, even the work of the same artist using the same character, you can get this enormous diversity of composition and line and balance and so forth. So these are the key things. And in this, a lot of times people outside of Japan or outside of East Asia are very intimidated looking at calligraphy, thinking, I don't understand this. I don't have any language training. But actually, you don't need that. It's helpful, obviously, on some level, and we'll get into that a bit, but really not focusing on the meaning of the character, but focusing on the line and the composition and the balance and all of that is a very direct and necessary way to approach calligraphy. One other thing about calligraphy that is well known by calligraphers and sometimes comes up here and there, but is all too little discussed, is that far from being a 2-dimensional art form, it's really a 3-dimensional art form, especially in the semi-cursive and cursive forms. And I'm choosing this one because it's especially clear, although you can see it in the works in the gallery as well. So let's follow, and this is where a little knowledge about the stroke order of characters is useful, or even without that, you can often figure it out. So this character starts here and goes there and goes around like this, comes up like this, comes down here, goes over here, goes down here, and here, and here, and here. So not only is there like a dance-like movement that Addis often referred to, but there's a spatial movement. And particularly one of the main ways of depicting space in Asian painting was overlap. And so things that, in that sense, we can go back over this again. So in this case, this stroke here is actually the most distant stroke, and then it's coming around in front and going down here, and then thrusting forward, going down, and then coming again forward. So it keeps moving closer and closer to us until this is in proximity. When the ink is of mixed tonalities like this is particularly evident. But even when it's not that way, you can still follow this. And so that one thing that's exciting about looking at cursive calligraphy is the 3-dimensionality of it. And that's where the space comes in a very literal sense. Turning to Rengetsu, this is Tessai's portrait that we've already seen several times in the earlier talk of Rengetsu, and much more rarely reproduced sketches by another contemporary that worked with Rengetsu, Suzuki Hakunen, and there are 3 sketches that he was making. We can see the similarities between these. and get some sense that this is really something like an accurate vision of Rengetsu in her old age. But I also want to point to the brush here, because this is a very unusual brush position. It's really very typical in China, but it's less typical in Japan, and especially less typical for somebody writing waka. If we can, I don't know if you can see my hand here, but the typical Japanese brush position is usually at a diagonal like this. Here we're seeing this vertical brush held like this is a Chinese form that was, and what we don't know is Tessai was probably doing this because he was very influenced in this, and whether Tessai was drawing Rengetsu's hand in the way he holds a brush in a Chinese manner, or accurately reflecting hers. But I suspect that this may have been her approach, because one of the virtues and the reasons why the Chinese insist on this is you have the so-called center brush tip, where the tip of the brush is in the center. When you go towards the side, you get sokuhitsu, where the tip of the brush is on one side and the belly of the brush is on the other, and it leads to different types of effects. But you don't see sokuhitsu in Rengetsu, except a little bit in some of her letters. And so it's quite likely that she was actually using, in a very atypical way, this verticality. You'll also notice how long and thin the brush is, and that'll come up. Just keep that in your mind, because we'll see some brushes in a moment. In looking at her work, it's with these tanzaku, these vertical poem strips of paper that were actually started around the Kamakura period and then moved on later. Be interested in going in the history of that, but we don't have time. But looking at the details here, and we have, again, character for kusuri here, the medicine here on the right. And you see, if we trace the movement of the brush again, starting out here, coming around here like this. And not only is it sort of a dance-like movement, but again, it's easy to visualize this spatially. When you had the inkment variations within the stroke in the previous one, it's even easier, but it's here well. And here too, in the lower character. Other things to note here is what happens with her strokes, particularly things like this, which we'll mention later. The brush came down here, and it's not only pausing, it's changing direction. And it's changing direction fairly rapidly. And we know it's doing it rapidly because if you change the direction very slowly, the hairs of the brush have time to adjust to the change in direction, and so it doesn't create this sort of splotch that we see here that's typical of her work. Because when this happens, the brush is moving at a pace where the hairs of the brush don't have time to untwist, and they flip like this. And it's the flipping of the brush hairs that creates this. If you ever see a skillful calligrapher doing cursive script, look at the tip of the brush, because it's almost like a little fish flopping back and forth, because when it gets to these points, the brush flips like that, right? But if it's gone slowly, the hairs have time to align themselves. This is also useful in figuring out what's an original Rengetsu and somebody who's meticulously copying the work. The copyist will go at a slower pace, and so this effect is usually absent. They may, if it's a good copy, they'll get the overall shape right, but they won't get this right. And so this is sort of a technical point, but it also gets the expressive quality of the line and the movement that's involved. Here's another example, and this is something interesting about her career, is that she moved from a rather traditional style called Oye Ryu that had been going on for centuries to a much more personalized style And she kept improving her art to her last year, especially in calligraphy. There's a clear-cut evolution, and it continued to move towards this kind of incredibly elegant and potentially mesmerizing kind of script if you look at it very closely. Here we see some of those same turning points that I was talking about. But also you see the fluidity of the movement of the brush. It's not just the fluidity. Fluidity can be done in a very slack and lapsadaisical way, but this is anything but. It's very decisive. And also the movement here, she's increasingly an older woman, but it's almost like carved. In other words, extremely decisive, smooth. There's no wavering or quivering in any of this. It's part of the beauty of it is this sheer, I don't know, there's sort of a tensile quality to the line. And this tensile quality to this line and the decisiveness with which it's written, so on the one hand it's very delicate, but on the other hand it's very decisive. It's not written with hesitation or indecision. It's just the opposite of that. This type of line is sometimes in Chinese terms called as an iron wire line. So on the one hand, you have a sense of extreme delicacy, but on the other hand, you have a sense of extreme strength, decisive power, and a sort of surety in what she's doing that keeps increasing as she ages. Here we have a contrast between one of her earliest works, which is a detail of one that's in the exhibition that we've already seen on the right, and then one much later in life. And you can easily see, I think, large differences in the layout of the compositions and so forth. This calligraphy on the right, it's not like it's bad calligraphy, but it's kind of traditional calligraphy. Much of it could have been done by many calligraphers. It's not that distinctive. And it has a looseness to the writing and the structure and the flow of the characters that's very, very different than the decisive and sort of precision and movement of the brush here is quite distinctively different. To look at this in more detail, which may be easier to see, we can see these lines. Like on the left, in the early work here, we have lines like this where you have, again, it's nice calligraphy, but by comparison, this is kind of good to incredible in terms of the difference of the development of the style as she moved from a type of calligraphy that many people were doing to someone that only she was doing this. And so she really had a tremendous evolution. And again, if we're following the movement here, we can go like this and like this and like this. And these incredibly elegant sweeping curves. We have curves here, but if you look at these curves and you look at these curves, then you see a world of difference between the two. And it's not that this isn't, again, it's not to say that the earlier one is bad, but the earlier one is more standard, less individualized. And the one on the right is what people seek in her work. If you're looking at the marketplace, one of the problems for scholarship is we really need to find more and more of her earlier work to more fully understand it. But it's hard to sell it. Most people, oh, this is an early work. Who needs it? You know, everybody is looking for this sort of peak style that we see there on the right. Making a character by character. These are different characters, but again, here's the late style on the left and the early style on the right. And again, they're both good, but if you look at the movement of the line here, coming down here, and it's not just the movement of the line, but look at the very subtle differences in the modulation of the line. So it's here, it gets almost disappears, comes down here, and here get one of these flips, comes up here, another flip, over here, another flip, up there, and then moving around like that. Here we have nice movements, but this line is, by comparison, almost unmodulated. And the way these lines are modulated in here are radically different. And in terms of elegance and her distinctive style, this is where she was moving towards from the earlier type that we see on the right. This is true in his signatures too, and these are from the same two works, but you see both of these are Rengetsu, and they're both cursive, with a Lotus character on the top and the moon on the bottom. Her early signatures are very distinctive, and the earlier they are, the more prominent this line is. It goes much lower down. And as she goes later, it not only shrinks up and gets shorter, but the character kind of turns on its side and becomes slanted. And the way she does the Hasu, or the Lotus, the Ren of her signature, is radically changed. Scholars have charted her signatures to help in understanding this evolution, and this is one set of examples where you can see what I was talking about with this line here being very long and then getting shorter, and the whole angle of the characters and the relation of one character to another, and the way the upper character gets increasingly abbreviated is a reasonably consistent pattern that helps in dating. She didn't really date her works until the mid-60s. These are her age here, but some of her earlier works are datable through other inscriptions or other kinds of circumstances. So this is a fairly good example of how her calligraphy, and particularly her signatures, evolved over time. If we're looking at again, qualitative distinctions, which, if you're dealing with things from two different periods, as we've seen, they can be quite different. But if they're very close in time, and these two works are supposed to be within 1 year of each other, so they should really be having pretty much the same style, they're really quite different, with the classic style of this time period being seen here. Well, here it's supposed to be just 1 year earlier, and although there are similarities of form, the way the line, the compositions are being done here is really very, very different. Take this character, very little modulation throughout the whole character, and actually you find that overall. And when you do get modulation, it just means, well, this is thick and this is thin. There's not the real subtleties even within one stroke. So there's actually really major differences between these two. And it raises a question about this. This work has a signature that is, if you just look at the signature, it looks fairly plausible. But when you look at the work as a whole, it becomes much less plausible. And the signatures were the easiest to copy because they have many, many examples. So while it can't be said to be definitive, it seems likely that the work on the left is a copy of some sort. That being said, she did huge numbers of tanzaku. She probably did as many works as Nantenbō, if you count all of her tanzaku, because on the marketplace, for instance, back in the 70s and 80s, you'd find albums of 100 tanzaku. Sometimes they were assembled by a collector of various dates, but other times they were all from the same year. And it meant that she was sort of producing handwritten albums of her verse, which is a very interesting idea. You know, you have your woodblock printed, but then you'd have, 100 different poems written at the same time and put in the same album. These albums used to be around in some number, but because of marketplace, it's not only easier to sell them separately. If you sell 100 separately, you're undoubtedly going to get much more money than selling. The problem here is that these haven't been photographed that much, and so every year there are fewer intact sets. Really, to understand her poem and her presentation, those should be photographed and cataloged to see, particularly the ones that weren't assembled but later piecemeal by collectors, but seem to have all been done at the same paper at the same time as kind of handwritten books of her poetry, which is something that's very important but hasn't been studied as yet. Another thing way of seeing how different her work was this very interesting pair of hand scrolls. There was a Tendai priest, Eishu Shonin, who is in Fukugawa, who commissioned what he considered to be the 44 best calligraphers of Japan, half doing Chinese-style poems, half doing waka, and they weren't just from the Tokyo area, but all over Japan. They even included some people from Shikoku and other places, and indeed were noted poets. The commission was that they all had to write a poem dealing with Kisho Ran. This priest had developed this type of orchid that he was celebrating, and he wanted to have this celebration of all these poets and their calligraphers doing this. And this shows the two hand scrolls, once entirely Chinese verse, once entirely Japanese verse, and Rengetsu is number 3. And they tend to do these things in albums and stuff with an order of precedence of importance. And she's the third one in the waka section, but you see her contemporaries and how radically different if you look through the whole scroll, you'll see this same amazing difference of the extreme thinness of her work and this sort of elegance. And these are more typical styles of the time period. And I'm just showing this to give you a really physical sense of how radically different her calligraphy was from most of the contemporary poets at the time, poet calligraphers. We can look briefly at her signature to that and again get a sense of this extreme elegance use of curvilinear line. We're going to see how it's proceeding down here, then looping around like this. And then her signature. This is also written on a gray silk. Clearly, all of the poems were on an identical size silk, and the person must have sent them all over Japan and said, do this, and then reassembled it when it got back. Actually, there are long postscripts and prefaces that explain the whole circumstances and everything. So it's kind of a scholar's dream. Everything you want to know about the scroll is there in long texts and inscriptions. And remember that long, thin brush I was talking about? Well, this is Rengetsu's Suzuri Bako. When I say it's hers, it's not one that we don't know that she used it, but she was probably commissioned to make it. And that's her very high quality painting of chrysanthemums, and there's very elegant waka calligraphy up here. But we see these very long, slender brushes, and this is just removing the tops so we can see the very long brush tips. Notice, though, that there's ink at the end of these. And it's very likely that these were used, but also, how do you, as a calligrapher, maintain this incredible thinness to the stroke? If you dealing like in a Nantenbō or a usual calligraphy, you load the ink up more so that you don't have to redip the brush as much, and the ink will flow from this area down here as you're using it. But this incredible, one blotch destroys the whole thing. So you have to have not only incredible precision to do a narrow line, but you see these amazingly subtle variations to the line width. And she's using brushes like this and probably just dipping the very tip of the brush in, and then, but even since it's so minute, the amount of ink that she's using, she could probably write quite a bit and only have to redip a couple of times in a waka, just using this tip and leaving the rest of the brush dry. And releasing the rest of the brush dry is very stiff, which is also very helpful in doing this. So it's a very interesting recent discovery in Rengetsu research. Where did her style come from? There's been a lot of speculation, but I think the dominant research is that she was spending a good part of the latter half of her career researching the lives of women in the late Han court, their literature, their poetry, and this is just a fragment that's a designated work now, and it was at Manchuin Temple. They have a very important collection of kohitsu, and for a couple of years, mid-career, Rengetsu was living at Shinshoji, a Zen temple that no longer exists. That's when also Tesai, as a boy, was helping her. And at that time, she knew a monk, Tendai monk, Rake Jihon, who was one of the key people working at Manchuin. And the distance between Shinshoji and Manchuin is about 20 minutes, 30 minutes walking, and they're very close. And she was very close to Rake Jihon for several decades. That may have given her an opportunity to see this work at Manchuin. But whether she saw this work or a copy of it or something similar, this is about as close as you can find in the late Han calligraphies. It's been attributed to various people, including Yukinari, but the Yukinari attribution, which has been published in the last 60, 70 years, has been completely disproven. It's anonymous at this point. But there is an older tradition that it wasn't written by a male calligrapher, but by a female calligrapher, a famous Han poet, a bit earlier time, Ko-o Gimi, or sometimes Kodai no Gimi. And it may have been that early attribution to a female writer that prompted Rengetsu to see works, this work or works like this. And if you, well, let's look to another detail. You can see it's not like she's, if this is a model, it's not like she's precisely copying it, but you see a lot of the same similar features like this. And again, the decisiveness of these curves and lines is again something approaching an iron wire kind of certainty. And there are lots of features here that are very close to what are in her work. So whether it was this work or other ones like it, the only historical parallels you really find for this kind of calligraphy are certain examples of late Han kohitsu, and that was part of her overall fascination with that time period that came out in many aspects of her work. This is part of the transmission through time, because here she is in late Edo and early Meiji, and she's not looking at her contemporary, she's not looking at the Edo, she's not looking at Muromachi, she's looking at late Han. This is another detail of that work. Turning to her ceramics, we've already seen, this is one in the exhibit, and we saw a few images of it earlier. Her calligraphy in terms of her ceramics, the largest number were incised, and she used bamboo and metal implements. Some of her implements that she used are still there at Jinkoin, so we actually can know. I don't have a photograph for you, but they do exist. And lots of remarkable features about her ceramic calligraphy. Most of them, like I was saying, are incised, but she also did them with slip. I don't have any slip examples to show you, but they're extremely sophisticated and more closely relate to her ink work, although ceramic slip and ink are so different in texture and consistency that to get an ink-like quality with slip is extraordinarily difficult, but she was quite good at that. But here we have her incised work. Things to look for in her incised work are smoothness of incision, because when they're really smooth, like we see here, if you look at this, there's no feeling or appearance of chipping involved. In other words, if it had really gotten to a fully hardened state, to incise it, it will involve chipping. And it looks a little like seal carving, if you know what that's like, with little chips appearing around the edge of the line. But this had to be a leather hard state where it's firm enough to stand, but still moist enough that you could incise it without any of that chipping quality. And so these may be difficult to see, but this is all very smooth. And it also allows for a certain fluency in the line that's much harder to achieve if you're kind of chipping it out. So that's one of the qualities of this. But her tokuri in particular, incredibly thin. You know, we're talking about maybe 1.5 millimeters, 2 millimeters, very, very thin. The way it's displayed is perfect because you can look down inside and just see how incredibly thin. You pick one of these up, it's just amazingly thin and fragile. And then it's that thin, but she's incising into it without either penetrating the wall or collapsing the vessel. These are so hard to make without any incision, just having it self-supporting without it collapsing itself. This is what forgeries are almost always too thick because the potters couldn't generate this kind of extreme thinness, much less, engrave in it. I have some theories about how this could be done, but that will be another occasion. But if we look, one more aspect about this work that's interesting is looking, here you see how thin it is. Actually, with the spotlight in there is actually going down inside, which is wonderful, because the inside of the wall, this is the outside here. You have the join on the base, and there was mention of thumbnails or something that we would get. These are semicircular nail impressions that you finally found, where she's pinching together a flat base and the side wall, and so you often get those marks. Sometimes you even get fingerprints. The thing is, though, is that she did that on the outside, but she didn't smooth down the inside. Normally potters would do this on the outside, but when you have a low level, you go in and smooth out the join on the inside. She didn't do that. So if you look down in there, you can see that the base and the wall are kind of curving like this, and there's no clay or smoothing down to the inside at all. So it's one of her unique personal traits in constructing most of her tokuri. So it's another thing to look for. And by accident, it's fairly well illuminated in the show, so go take a look later. And the base is just as thin as anything else. This is another example of a larger, more fully bodied tokuri. This color is more typical. The previous one, that had a darker clay, which she used from time. There's another darker clay. She used various clays, but this kind of creamish color clay was most common. And this was a special commission, probably never used very much, but it gives you a sense again of the thinness. And let's look at a detail or two. When we're thinking about the calligraphic forms and when you're looking at different incisions that she made, this is an example of extreme sophistication in her incisions, because you can see how it starts out shallow, gets deeper and deeper and deeper, broader, and then thinner, very, very thin. And she's literally in a subtle three-dimensional, trying to give some of the qualities of her hand writing. And it's another thing that never turns up in good, even good forgeries. They don't get to this level. And Rengetsu is not always at this level either. This is a special commission that was done near the peak of her skill, near the end of her life. But it does show how sophisticated she could get in her incision work with her waka. This is the base, and for some of these, this is not a pinched base. I mean, it had to have been pinched, but it's been smoothed out. But the piece must have been inverted a bit, so it forms a natural concavity, which for this type is what you find, not a flat base, but a concave base. But what's this over here? This is turning the pot up and looking down inside and having a strong light on the other side to show you just how the base is so thin that it becomes translucent. And so this is the translucency of this same piece, with you have a light shining from underneath it. And so the phenomenal thinness. A lot of people have snubbed, professional potters have looked at her work and say, this person isn't a potter. They don't know any of the standard techniques. They don't know how to do this. And she was self-taught. She did have some education in using clay and stuff, but her techniques are really her own. But they, in her unique manner, developed extreme skills that even professional potters find it very hard to mimic. So it's not the traditional skill, very eccentric skill, but given what she's doing, it's a very highly refined and accomplished skill in some of these aspects. This is the box. Boxes signed by the artist, whether of any sort, are called tomobako in Japanese, and it's one of the best guides. Of course, something could be, a fake piece can be inserted into a real box, but that actually rarely happens with her works. You can't say it never happens, but it's quite rare, and having a tomobako is one of the best guides or assurances. And here we have her calligraphy to the tokoro we were just looking at was a pear that was put into the box together, and here's the text where this was being created at request to the Konomi of Fuji no Uchi when she's 81 years old. And in any case, there's a lot about her box construction, but we can move on. This is in the exhibition, and we can see the obverse here on the right, but we can't see the underneath, which is quite phenomenal. It's meant to be a lotus leaf, and you have the veining and also this pebbly texture. This kind of skillful use of a one-sided mold is a trait of Kuroda Koryo, her primary later assistant in making ceramics. And anytime you see this pebbly quality or this kind of one-sided mold, you know that that's his work. He's also got a seal here, which is a little hard to see, but we'll look at it in a minute in detail. And this fretwork here is his work. In any case, this would have been a sheet of clay pressed in an open one-side mold and then smoothed it out. And then let's look at what the surface decoration is. Here's the seal that I was pointing out, and it's Ko Ryozan. He had several seals, but this is the most common that we see there on the left, this Ko Ryozan. But here's a detail of the beginning of the waka, and again, you can see that there's not that chipping quality. Of course, here it's a plate, so you don't have the collapse problem, but still, it's a very sophisticated modulation of the line that's thicker and gets very, very thin, and then even these kind of aspects here, even this kind of turning. So it's likely that this inscription is actually by her. The work was made by him, and then she inscribed it. There are many letters, dozens of letters of Rengetsu to Koryo specifying, I want so many of this and so many of that. And so she was, as she became more and more popular, she couldn't keep up with it. And also, she was aging, and there's a lot of, even if they're small pieces, the ceramic is a very physical activity. This fretwork that we see here is also a typical thing that Koryo did. If you see this kind of stamped fretwork, it's always work by Koryo. Most of the time he stamped his own name, but sometimes you see his techniques without his name to it, but the techniques are very identifiable as his work. He's supposed to have continued doing this after she died, including copying her inscriptions. And so there's always a point of vaguity of how skilled did he get with inscriptions. But most of them seem to be separable because she's getting better and better. And then suddenly there's ones that they get the form, but they don't get all of these subtleties that we see here. The Rengetsu is in huge confusion. One of the biggest confusions is the work of a much later potter, Han Iso, who was working in the Higashiyama area, making his, handmade pottery. He writes on it that teitsukuri. So if you have a box and you're saying, this is really handmade, you can get a sense of the level he was aiming at, in his audience, like no competitive or prestigious profit, whatever in the wildest dreams think of saying, hey, my work is handmade, so. But he was a man incredibly devoted to Rengetsu, and he was always frequently using Rengetsu's poems, mimicking her calligraphy. And then, this is a tomobako. This is his normal calligraphy style, but when he's doing Rengetsu, he does this. But he's throwing on a wheel and has all kinds of techniques that are not Rengetsu's techniques. Unfortunately, these have been entered into museums and appear in publications as being a contemporary of Rengetsu when he's an entirely different person and period. And it's a very interesting thing. But he wasn't generally making forgeries. He was selling them his own, their homages. It's his enthusiasm, which was very genuine for Rengetsu's work. You can see some of his techniques on the base here, depending on where you go. You can see the sort of grid pattern here. It looks a little like fabric, but to make such a deep impression, it's probably a wire screen of some sort that he's putting on the wheel and allowing you to lift off really quickly at the end of each piece. And it's just sort of roughly, with a bamboo tool, there's kind of rather rough incisions around the base, and then this very sharp edge. And then one of the most distinctive features when he's making the foot, he always overlaps it like that. Usually just have a circle, but he always overlaps in this manner. So this, his manner of construction is way, way, way different than Rengetsu, actually, although it's been often confused. This is in the show, and is probably one of his earliest works. And it's different than what we have seen, but we still have some of the similar features. Here's his ISO seal that's often, mostly on his works, but you see that grid pattern again. And sometimes he did this angular foot, but even in this way, there's an overlap of the right here. And this is closer to Rengetsu in being hand pinched. And so for his work, this is, and for different aspects of his condition stuff, is likely one of his earliest works that we know of, although they're all undated. There's a detail of that where you can see the grid pattern and you can see the overlap I was talking about. And this shows him using his own style. You know, and these kind of glazes were very popular in the 1960s and into early 70s, and most of his things in his own style is like this. And he's got the same seal, ISO seal, and the same kind of thing here. But look underneath, he did a copy of a Rengetsu poem in her style. And so it's caused a great deal of confusion that needs to be sorted out. And recently this came up as a statement from 1939 where he's declaring why he's doing this. Unfortunately, this is lifted from the net, and you can see a lot of it's out of focus, so it's still hard to get the whole text, but it's a statement of his sort of adoration of Rengetsu and why he's doing these kinds of wares. Moving along, I'll have to pick up the pace, I'm sorry. We have Nantenbō. This is, Nantenbō did self-portraits like this, but this is actually by his Deshi, Deiryu, but Nantenbō put his own inscription on it. And it gives you a sense of the person or his persona as he liked to project it. Here is him writing his biggest calligraphy ever, which was going to be a colossal stele. And this is just one character, the No of Nogi. And there's a 7-character inscription that he was making. He was very close to the General Nogi, who was famous for Junshi suicide with his wife at the death of the Meiji Emperor. And the two of them were very close. In any case, he's at Kaiseiji making this colossal calligraphy. The stele was never made, but he did all this. And when he did these calligraphies, he had a lot of extra ink left over, and they were used for the calligraphies that will be seen in a minute at the same occasion. But through remarkable circumstance, Nantenbō's order books, some of them have emerged, and he talks about order books near the end of his life. He said one of his students calculated all of his order books and said there were some 80,000 some orders, and they started at a certain point of life, so he done before them and he continued afterwards, so the 100,000 idea is probably accurate. And you can see he was very meticulous, you know, with the size of the paper that he was using, how many one, two, or sometimes many more. And then annotation at the beginning of the phrase that he was to write, and then who was ordering it, and then checking them off later as being completed with the red marks, and so he's keeping meticulous record of everything. And this is another one from the first book that survived was literally book number 1, covered 6 years. Book number 3 of the same size covered 6 months. And so you see the rapid expansion, and yet the period that these notebooks are from are described in a dissertation as being the type when he wasn't doing many. In other words, from here on, it really, his production really took off. Also in there's this phrase, they're all 1 yen. And later on in one of his writings, he said he sold his works all for 1 yen apiece, which sounds like nothing, but yen at that time was a big silver coin. Sometimes it was worth more than an American silver dollar, and it's the same size. So when you're thinking one at a time, it's still quite a bit of money at the time. Might have a couple weeks worth of meals maybe, but if you're doing hundreds and hundreds of them, you're really talking about, and then thousands and thousands. He was getting quite an income, which he would have used for temple expenses and so forth. One of his most famous kinds of things, we have several examples of the dramatic Nanten staff works that we see here. And just to give you a comparison, this is the actual Nanten staff that he was famous for. And the calligraphy here is by Yamaoka Teshu, actually, who was a close friend of his and a student of his calligraphy. In any case, you can see both similarities and difference. People, I think, are on a mistaken impression that Nantenbō was clubbing his students with this Nanten staff. I think this is highly improbable. He was obviously carrying it and it became emblematic of who he was. But the keisaku, which we see here, is actually what's used in a rinzai setting. And it's not a punishment stick. It's something to keep you alert, or your back is hurting. You can request it to be done. If you're doing a lot of zazen and you have extraordinary pain in your back, you bend over and it's slapped on either side of the spine, and it has it's not painful, it numbs you. And so it actually takes the pain away for 15 to 20 minutes. In any case, this just gives some comparative things. But this kind of dramatic flourish at the top, just how he did this, there's clearly twisting of the brush. It's not only slapping of the brush, but a twisting of the brush, and very interesting dramatic expressive mode. Here's another one of his fine calligraphies, which is not only an interesting koan, and the main calligraphy is good, but it gives a good example of the cursive quality of his dramatic evolution of his signature, where this is toshu at the end, but it becomes sort of a series of loops and becomes close to a cow, eccentric cow, but actually it's characters. And then comparing the two, there's the one in the show and a comparison work from a year earlier. So it's the same poem, very similar, but when you look at it closely, there's lots of differences as well. And we look at that. This shoki is a rough translation would be like sing out, but you can see that, again, the movement of the line here going like this and then coming around here, and then doing this coming up and ending over here. But if you look at you can easily see for yourself the similarities and yet some dramatic differences between the two. All of his works, even when they're doing the same, and he did a standard repertory, because he did hundreds, maybe thousands of some of these, they're all unique when looked at closely. One of the most dramatic things that happened long after his death, though, was the avant-garde artist who in the 1930s was a surrealist, Yoshihara Jiro, was going to a funeral at Nantenbō's Hontenbō Kaiseiji around 1951. And he went there and he found that the main building was surrounded with these dramatic fusuma panels that were then which overwhelmed him, and it was written about in an early Bokubi calligraphy magazine where Yoshihara relates what happened at that time, because he was so thunderstruck by these calligraphies. here we see them. These are huge. You know, each one is a Fusuma panel, which means these are larger than I am, and one character per panel. And he was overwhelmed by this, and he contacted Morita Shiryo, Suda Kokota, and with another year, Inoue Yuichi was also coming here. These are really at the beginning. It was really, Yoshihara became the founder of Gutai, but that's still years after this. So this amazing impact of these works by Nantenbō on the avant-garde post-war calligraphy is incredible, and it's written about in several issues, early issues of Bokubi at the time, where they're discussing the reactions and what is inspiring them to do. So it's extremely, this is the other half of that expression. If we look at it, this gives you a better sense of the impact of these works, which among all of his surviving works, and this was done at the same time as when we see him standing with a big brush. This is what he did, because he had so much ink left. He said, what am I going to do with all this ink? It's a shame to waste it. So they're all the Fusuma panels. So he did this very quickly on these and made these outstanding works that are never exhibited, but are there in the Bokubu issue and became inspiring for Inoue Yuichi. Here's comparison between Nantenbō and Yuichi splatter. There are closer comparisons, but gives the idea. Here you get a sense very clearly how he's twisting the brush, because the splatter is going in various directions. It couldn't be done with just a simple slap. And Suda Kokota's work and Morita Shiryu. And the inso, this isn't, I mean, it's a painting within an inso, but he did actual insos. But of course, Yoshihara at the end of his career was mostly doing insos in a very dramatic form like this. And so we see Nantenbō inspiring people decades after his death in ways that he could never have imagined. And we get this sense of Rengetsu reviving certain aspects of Kohitsu from the late Han, and then Nantenbō inspiring people long after his death, and we get a sense of the continuity and movement through time, which is part of my point. So thank you for your patience.